Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Bob Hornstein. I'm the Director of Community Relations and Public Affairs for the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland. And tonight is the final of our 6 webinars that are exploring the history of discrimination in the state of Oregon. If you have not yet seen any of the recordings, then you can go to jewishportland.org/uncovering. I hope you will do that because they're all worth seeing. Now, coming up in May, this is the big program that we're starting to plan, and we're excited about it. On May 26th, from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., we have a virtual conference, a summit, a call to confront hate. Now, we know it's in the middle of the day, but we hope that if you know in advance and you can save this date, that you'll be able to join us, if not for the full 4 hours, for at least part of it. It's an exciting program that we're putting together with our community partners. Those logos that you saw at the beginning, those are the partners that have been helping us to plan this major event. It will start off with a introduction to implicit bias, and then we will have breakout sessions exploring current topics, intense topics, such as the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism, the growing threat of white nationalism, QAnon and conspiracy theories, systemic racism in our criminal justice system, and many other important topics. And then we'll have Eric Ward as our keynote speaker, Eric from Western State Center, who will be talking about where we go from here. What are the strategies and resources that are available for us to come together as a community to combat hate? You can look at the chat where you will find the link to register for that event. We hope you will do so. I also want to thank our sponsors for tonight, the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, of course, along with the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, and all of the other organizations that have been involved in the webinar series. Now, I know tonight we're talking about anti-Semitism, but I'm sure that our thoughts and prayers are with the Asian community, with our sisters and brothers in that community. And I'm not just referring to what happened, the senseless violence that occurred in Georgia this week, but in fact, over 3,800 attacks have happened against Asian Americans, Pacific Islander Americans over the last year since the beginning of the pandemic. I'm sure that I speak for all of you when I say that an attack against anyone because of their ethnicity, their race, their religion, or their sexual orientation is an attack against all of us. And I hope you will take the time to reach out to those that you know in the Asian community, whether they're friends or neighbors, and reach out and let them know that you support them and that you're thinking of them. It's really important that we do so. So I'm going to now hand it over to Judy Margles, the director of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, who will be moderating tonight's discussion. Judy?
Great. Thank you, Bob, for those remarks. I just also really want to thank Bob and Ellen Eisenberg, who I'm going to introduce more fully shortly, for participating in tonight's program. I also really want to say thank you to the Federation for coordinating this critically timed series. It's urgent that we're having these conversations, so kudos to Federation for pulling everyone together. These programs have highlighted the way that those of us in the Jewish community, whether we're teaching or perhaps because of our own alarming experiences of anti-Semitism, have learned the importance of creating community with others who are willing to work together in the fight against hate and discrimination in all its forms. So I also really want to thank everyone who's been on this amazing committee putting together the summit, putting together these programs. It's been really wonderful to get to know you and hear your stories as well. Bob mentioned this. I think it's worth mentioning again. It was just really 3 weeks ago that our last program on hidden histories took place. It was about anti-Asian discrimination. In it, we discussed the ways in which this vamping up of anti-Chinese rhetoric has led to a surge in violent attacks on Asian Americans. And Bob, of course, just gave you the statistics. We know about this heinous killing in Atlanta on On Tuesday night, I just echo Bob's sentiments. Our hearts go out to the families of victims, to the Asian and Pacific Islander communities for this latest and reprehensible tragedy. At my institution, the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, we teach about discrimination in all its insidious forms, and anti-Semitism is certainly one of them. As we have seen the last few years, we've witnessed a resurgence of anti-Semitism that has included hate speech, bullying, defacement of Jewish sites, violence, and murder. Anti-Semitism, it's not just one big undifferentiated phenomenon. It's really a patchwork of attitudes, ideas, and behaviors with many threads. Tonight's program is going to provide a terrific opportunity to problematize and unpack the term anti-Semitism and see how and if it relates to Oregon's own history. Eric Ward, who runs the Western State Center in Portland, and as Bob said, he's going to be the keynote at the summit in May. He's devoted much of his recent work on the connections between anti-Semitism and white nationalist ideology in the United States, and why this is a problem that must be addressed by all communities. As he articulated in his groundbreaking article, The Skin in the Game, and I think you can see the article posted in the chat. If you haven't read it, I urge you to read it. And as he talks in that article, he says anti-Semitism, he talks about anti-Semitism as being unique among conspiracy theories. He talks about it as being expandable, and the way in which it's been used for much more than just street level hatred of Jews. In fact, as he says, it's been used for all kinds of purposes, serving as an all-encompassing explanation of what is wrong with the world. Simply put, Jews can be blamed for absolutely everything. He's gone on to further recognize that anti-Semitism, rooted as deeply as it is in white nationalism, is not a crisis for the Jewish community, but must be a crisis for all communities. So to help us understand more precisely what, if any, discrimination Oregon Jews faced from their earliest days of settlement, and more about how anti-Semitism manifests in our lives, we're fortunate to have two great experts with us. I'm going to introduce both of them to you. We'll get the conversation rolling. I just want to remind you of the Q&A chat, the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I believe it's at the bottom of everybody's screen with Zoom. Please put your questions there, and I promise that we'll get to as many as possible. I'm going to introduce our speakers. Welcome, Ellen Eisenberg. Ellen holds the Dwight and Margaret Lear Chair in American History at Willamette University, where she teaches courses on the history of the United States since the Civil War, with an emphasis on immigration, ethnicity, and race. Her published work includes 5 monographs and a number of articles on American Jewish history, with a focus on the American West. The first to cry down injustice, Western Jews and Japanese removal during World War II, was a 2008 National Book Award finalist. Recent works have included 2 volumes on the history of Jews in Oregon, titled Embracing a Western Identity, Jewish Oregonians 1849 to 1950, and The Jewish Oregon Story 1950 to 2015. Currently, Ellen is editing an anthology tentatively titled Jews as Whites, Jews as Others, Relational Identities in the American West. Bob Hornstein, who you heard from at the beginning of the program, Bob is the Director of Community Relations of the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, a post he's held since 1994, and he directs the Federation's efforts to safeguard the social safety net, promote civil rights, combat hate and bigotry, and strengthen the local community's ties to Israel. Bob earned his master's degree in political science, specializing in Arab-Israeli politics from Portland State University. I should say Bob's, I think he'll say more this evening, but he's a native Oregonian, a native Portlander. Bob is also a freelance writer, having been published in the Oregonian, Jerusalem Post, and the Forward. He's also a regular contributor to the Jerusalem Report. Bob has received awards, the American Jewish Press Association Louis Rappaport Award for Excellence in Commentary. He's also been recognized by the Oregon Society of Professional Journalists for Excellence in Journalism. And Bob is a frequent speaker at local synagogues, churches, and schools. He's lectured across the country. So thank you both for joining us. for a pretty tricky conversation. If you want to unmute perhaps and turn your videos on, that would be awesome. I'm going to start with Ellen. And Ellen, I'm just going to ask you a really, really broad question. Just talk about the experience of Oregon Jews as they settled in the state.
Sure, Judy, and thank you for the introduction. I should probably start maybe by apologizing to those who might have come to a session on the hidden history of anti-Semitism, expecting me to recount a long litany of forgotten anti-Semitic events. That's really not the story, at least not of early Oregon Jewish history, because the reality is that it's a story of remarkable acceptance. The first Jews who came to Oregon beginning in 1849 were largely German immigrants. Some of them were American born, who were peddlers and merchants. And most of them had already spent time in the United States, in many cases, years in the United States, and they came west in the wake of the gold rush, many first to California and then north to Oregon. And the timing was really important to their settlement and to their acceptance. They were new settlers in a society that was welcoming, if not recruiting, new settlers, and they brought a useful skill set. So if their skill set really matches community needs. So if you imagine yourself in the middle of nowhere in Oregon, either in a mining town or as a farmer, there are all sorts of things that you don't have access to, from needles to material, all sorts of things. And people who are able to establish supply networks and get those things to you are incredibly welcomed. As are people who can extend you credit, because of course, if you're a farmer, you don't have anything to live on until the harvest comes in. And so they're very much welcomed to communities across the state. And they're looking to establish themselves here. Often they bring families or they marry shortly after they get here. And they're seen as a real stabilizing force, shoring up new communities. And they get involved in those communities very fully. They're the founders of the chambers of commerce, and they serve on town councils. And there's all sorts of indications of the ways in which they were welcomed and accepted. They belong to all of the fraternal and social organizations, the Masons and the Elks and that sort of thing. They're very widely elected to office, everything from town councils to mayors. There are mayors from Burns to Astoria, including a couple in 19th century Portland. There are many who serve in the State House, and even a US Senator still in the 19th century, in the 1890s, Joseph Simon. And when you look at their experiences in these towns as town founders and their experiences as politicians, what you really notice is that they're really not othered. So when they're talked about in the press, for example, they're not labeled as Jewish. People know that they're Jewish. There will be announcements in the press that the store will be closed because of a Jewish holiday, or an account of a wedding that mentions that a rabbi performed the ceremony. So it's no secret that they're Jewish, but it's simply not remarkable, right? And that's in contrast to other parts of the country where often Jewish politicians are labeled as Jewish, kind of othered. Now, that's not to say that there's no anti-Semitism, obviously. There are incidents, but it's really interesting that almost everyone who writes about Jews in early Oregon points to the same incident, an Oregonian editorial that was particularly scathingly anti-Semitic in 1858, and to which kind of the pillars of community, the non-Jewish pillars of the community, respond frequently, immediately, and quite harshly. And so that's kind of indicative of, that this is a particular episode, but it is not the pattern. And you see that pattern of broad acceptance all the way up into the early 20th century, even when anti-Semitism is rising on the East Coast and the West. And the story here in Oregon doesn't really change much until the teens, and then especially in the 20s and 30s. As you get into those interwar years, that's when we really see the uptick in anti-Semitism here. It's a period when there's a new group of immigrants arriving, both Eastern Europeans and also Sephardic immigrants who are from the Eastern Mediterranean. There are more recently arrived immigrants, so they're more foreign in certain ways. They settle, instead of across the state, they settle clustered in Portland in the first and probably the only ever ethnically Jewish neighborhood in Oregon. And their arrival coincides and with the rise of anti-Semitism nationally and also locally. So this is the era when the KKK comes to the fore in Oregon. And you really see that impact in the 20s and the 30s. So when Julius Marr, for example, runs for governor in 1930, he wins very decisively, but there is an explicitly anti-Semitic campaign against him where he's portrayed as a greedy, tight-fisted, self-interested, tricky businessman, right? And more broadly in the 20s and 30s, this is an era when we see society just is not open to Jews in Oregon or nationally. And here it's not open in the way that it was in the 19th century. So there are all sorts of professional and social restrictions that last into the 40s, 50s, and in some cases with the most elite clubs into the 60s and 70s. And Jewish Oregonians in this era, they develop a real strong sense of themselves as a minority and as people who need to fight anti-Semitism, but also racism and injustice more broadly. So Gus Solomon, for example, when he's a young lawyer in Portland, he can't get a job at a law firm, right? Later, when he's a federal judge, he makes a personal campaign of placing a Jewish attorney in each of the major Portland law firms until he kind of breaks each one. And likewise with the country clubs and the elite clubs. And he's one of a substantial group of Jewish professionals, mostly lawyers, including some who came of age a little later than he did in the 40s and 50s, who have this experience, this personal experience of professional and social discrimination, and who became really centrally involved in the civil rights movement in Oregon and particularly in Portland. And they're the people that come together and write the state and city level fair housing legislation and public accommodations legislation and so on. And that activity really continues into the 70s, but by then the systematic anti-Semitism has essentially been vanquished. I mean, sure, there are incidents of anti-Semitism, but the whole restricted club, closed firm, off-limits neighborhood, all of that is gone by the 70s, and ideological anti-Semitism gets sort of relegated to the far right fringe, right? So the white nationalists of the 1990s and beyond. So yeah, that. You're muted, Judy.
I knew if I muted myself, I would forget to unmute. I apologize. Actually, I'd love to ask you a follow-up question just to help us understand. You mentioned the Oregonian article in 1858, and I agree. I know from our research that article is an anomaly, right? It does not. It is not indicative of the acceptance of Jews. How do you explain the article? How do you explain these sort of outbursts that we, as you say, there are incidents? Do you think the writer was not a native Oregonian and just, brought his prejudices with him? Like what?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that these anti-Semitic tropes are floating around. They're part of the larger culture in the United States and in Europe as well. And in the same way that they float around in the internet now and they're kind of there for people to grab onto, they're available. There's a historian, Natalia Molina, who talks about racial scripts and the idea of these kind of set ideas about groups of people that one can grasp onto in a sort of in an outburst. And so that material is there. And there's no doubt that there were people in early Oregon who subscribed to those ideas, but it's just not what you find as the norm or a pattern. And one of the advantages of being a 21st century historian is that the newspapers from early Oregon are digitized. So I've been able to go through and search for Hebrew, Israelite, Jew, all of the various terms that would designate Jews and see what all of these newspapers across the state, like when do these terms come up? And overwhelmingly, they either come up in a foreign story, about something happening abroad, or often they come up in local interest, very kind of just feature type stories saying, oh, the Jews in our town are celebrating Passover this week and they eat matzah, this is what they do. Very not very positive kinds of articles. And that is the much larger story than the periodic, isolated outburst of anti-Semitism.
Great, thank you. So, Bob, I'm so grateful to have both a scholar and I think, Bob, I would describe you more as a community organizer. I mean, you obviously have the expertise, but I think your perspective is going to be so helpful for this conversation. So what I'd love you to do for a few minutes is, define how can you easily define anti-Semitism for us, and talk about your experiences. I mentioned you grew up in Portland. You have studied anti-Semitism, you studied the trends, how it has, come and gone, waxed and waned over the years. So just talk about anti-Semitism, how it perhaps your personal experiences with it and how you see it's changed over the years.
Sure. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this will go well. Okay. So let's start here. Um, First of all, we all know that anti-Semitism is that age-old hatred, right? It's been with us for millennia, and it has evolved and it has changed. Still, some of the older forms of anti-Semitism, unfortunately, are still with us, but there are newer forms, and I'll get to that momentarily. So I want to harken back to my father's generation. My father was a native Portlander, as was I, of course, and he was born in 1920. And the way that he experienced anti-Semitism, thankfully, is not the way that we're experiencing it today. So, for example, when my father was at the ripe old age of 16, he attended the University of Oregon and he immediately joined the Jewish fraternity, the Sammy House. And you should know, of course, that the Jewish fraternities were established because Jews were not necessarily welcomed into the other fraternities. 2 years later, he transferred to Oregon State University because he pursued a degree in chemistry. And after the war, he wanted to get a job in that field, but unfortunately, anti-Semitism prevented him from achieving his career goals. He was offered a job from a chemical manufacturer in Pennsylvania, which was rescinded when they found out he was Jewish, as if they couldn't figure that out from his name to begin with. And so he ended up going to business school at night instead. Now, he could have pursued perhaps dental school or medical school, but we all know that back then there were quotas and there was a limit on the number of Jews who could be admitted to those schools. Now, the other aspect of anti-Semitism that my father experienced and that I was well aware of as a young boy was the fact that we had these, as Ellen noted, these country clubs or golf clubs that did not allow Jews. Excuse me. The Multnomah Athletic Club, which today, of course, has hundreds of Jewish members, but it wasn't until 1958 that they suspended their Gentiles only membership. And then it took another 11 years, 1969, before the Arlington Club and the University Club allowed Jews, and yet another 3 years before Waverly Country Club ended their Gentiles only membership policy. Now, I remember growing up in Southwest Portland, and only 3 miles away was the Portland Golf Club, and everyone knew, at least in our community, that Jews were not to become members of that particular golf club again until sometime in the 1970s. Now, in terms of a direct experience with anti-Semitism growing up, I will just tell you that the only time that I experienced it directly was when I was 11 years old. Now, I remember this. I remember where it happened, when it happened, and who did it. And I was playing basketball at Bridal Mile Elementary School, outside on the courts there. And it just so happened that another kid and I collided in the course of the game. And when we both got up off the ground, he stared me down and he called me a dirty Jew. And I've never forgotten that. This blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid who I had known since kindergarten suddenly was calling me a dirty Jew. And you have to wonder, an 11-year-old, where did that come from? So it sticks with you. Even though it may seem insignificant, I can tell you that it sticks with you. So how did we respond to, okay, am I trying to get my, here we go. Nope, it's not working. Hold on a second here. There we go. So how did we respond to this exclusionary nature of these country clubs, these recreational retreats? Well, you know about the Jewish community centers around the country, including in Portland. Why were they built? Because we were excluded from other centers and clubs. And back in 1912, a group of Portland area Jews, including Rabbi Jonah Weiss, who was a rabbi at what was then called Temple Beth Israel, they bought 100 acres of land so that they could build the Tualatin Country Club. And if you are around my age and you grew up in Portland, then you remember that it seemed as though every bar and bat mitzvah party was held at the Tualatin Country Club. Now, as we move forward into the 1980s, what we then see happening is that there are white nationalist groups taking root in the Pacific Northwest. Again, if you were around at the time or you've read about it, you may remember the tragic murder of Mulugeta Sarah, a 28-year-old Ethiopian man who was bludgeoned to death by 3 white supremacists who were associated with the White Aryan Resistance. That was this organization that was founded by Tom Metzger in northern Idaho. And you may recall that Tom Metzger ended up in a trial in Multnomah County, a civil trial that in effect bankrupted him. Moving ahead to the 2000s, and what we have happened here is, again, an uptick in white nationalist activity. And a lot of the focal point, unfortunately, was in Eugene. So back in 2002, 2 brothers who were associated with another white supremacist group called the Volksfront threw swastika emblazoned bricks through the windows of Temple Beth Israel. That's the congregation, the Reformed congregation down in Eugene. And 5 years later, at the Orthodox synagogue, Torah scrolls and prayer books were desecrated. Again, 10 years later, there is a white nationalist who is notorious, who is well known in the Southern Willamette Valley by the name of Jimmy Marr. Jimmy Marr, in April of 2017, drove his truck onto the campus of the University of Oregon, set up shop in front of the Urban Memorial Union, where students like to gather, and delivered a speech honoring Adolf Hitler's birthday. That year in Eugene, there were 60 hate crimes reported, many of which had an anti-Semitic nature to them. And this trend has only grown since then. So when we look at the statistics, now this is for 2019, I have not seen statistics for 2020 yet, but if you focus on the left-hand column, you'll notice that hate crimes that were perpetrated against religious communities in 2019, there were 1,521 of those, and 63% of those were committed against Jewish individuals or Jewish institutions. And that percentage has grown over the last few years. But the fact that the majority of hate crimes against religious communities has been perpetrated against the Jewish community, that has not changed. That's been fairly consistent, unfortunately, over the last few years. So I know that when we think about anti-Semitism, we tend to think about anti-Semitism coming from white nationalists, neo-Nazis, in other words, coming from the right. And there is no question that anti-Semitism that tends to be violent is almost exclusively coming from the right. However, there is another form of anti-Semitism that has shown up over the last 2 decades in particular. And Dr. Monica Schwartz-Friesel, who is a world-renowned expert on anti-Semitism from the Technical University in Berlin, sort of describes this new form of anti-Semitism, which she calls Israel-related anti-Semitism. And she connects it to the anti-Israel boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, or BDS movement. And she notes that it has been making Jew hatred respectable again by whitewashing it as criticism of Israel. Now, let's be clear here. First of all, no one is suggesting that everyone who is sympathetic to the BDS movement is an anti-Semite, nor are we suggesting that legitimate criticism of Israeli policy is anti-Semitic. That is not the case. However, what she's referring to is criticism that goes beyond the pale. For example, comparing Israel to Nazi Germany. And the German parliament, in a declaration in 2019, seemed to agree that the pattern of argument and methods of the BDS movement are anti-Semitic. And the United Nations, which often is no friend of Israel, issued a report 2 years ago in which they declared that the rhetoric and activities of the BDS movement are, quote, fundamentally anti-Semitic. How does that play out here locally? So 5 years ago, as an example, at Portland State University, the student government voted to adopt a BDS resolution, which was to encourage or urge the Portland State administration to divest funds from companies doing business in Israel. It passed overwhelmingly. And around that time, there was an incident where Portland Hillel students were tabling out in the park blocks. They were simply giving leaflets and talking to students about their organization and their programs, and they were spat upon. We also know that back then, there were student groups that refused to co-sponsor programs with Portland Hillel because they refused to disavow their Zionist identity. And you can see from then President Wim Wiewel, there he says, the tone and tenor of the BDS movement has made members of our communities, talking about Jewish students, feel unsafe and unwelcome at PSU, and it is not acceptable to marginalize or scapegoat them. Anti-Semitism, his words, cannot and will not be tolerated on our campus. Now, I'm happy to say that in the ensuing years under the administration of President Stephen Percy, things have improved dramatically. And this is an administration that has been very supportive of our Jewish students. And then lastly, and I'll end on this, we've seen more extreme forms of anti-Semitism on the left very recently, back in January, where 3 Israeli-style restaurants were vandalized with anti-Semitic graffiti. We've heard about dozens of Asian restaurants and businesses that have been targeted. And now here we also have this unfortunate incident back a few months ago. So I'll stop there and hand it back to Judy.
Thank you. No, that was awesome. And Ellen, I'm actually just going to ask a question sort of following up from Bob, because Bob, I really appreciated you pointing out the inability of Jews to get into country clubs, which was an endemic problem in Canada, in the United States. It certainly wasn't a problem only in Portland. But I want to probe a little bit with you, Ellen, and maybe I've been under a misnomer about some of these early Jewish settlers. And I'm really thinking of the Eastern Europeans and the Russians, that my sense is when they were excluded from something, they just said, we'll just build our own. So they had this masterful ability to replicate in their community in South Portland the organizations that wouldn't allow them in. So the Jewish Community Center, the neighborhood house, the orphanage, all sorts of things that they built for themselves, education. So can you comment on that? Like what? And Bob, I really appreciated your talking about your father, because it's easy, it's really important that we understand the trauma of these incidents. And I think, when we talk about it sort of away from the moment, you forget about the sort of the personal feelings. So Ellen, I think my question for you is, in your research, did you come out across Jews who are just really, really unhappy with their treatment in Oregon?
Yeah, absolutely. When we're talking about the generation of Bob's father, yeah, I think, mhm.
The Russian Jews, yeah.
The Russian Jews and the Sephardic Jews as well. I think people respond to that kind of adversity in various ways. And I think, in part, the community was a close-knit community, and there was a tendency to turn inward for other reasons as well. The children the vast majority of them are being sent to the community Hebrew school, and many people are buying, if not kosher food, then kind of ethnic food. And, there are a variety of institutions that are catering to the taste of the community, and people draw support from the community. And that is a positive spin and a true one. But at the same time, certainly there are people who are stung by the exclusion. People, you see it in the oral histories at the OGMCHA, right? People who talk about being excluded from high school sororities, and the hurt that causes, and the different path that they take because of that, or the people that are excluded from because of quotas. They're not able to pursue their whatever their career goal was, right? They have to alter their course. And people are different. For some people that chafes, and that's a bitter thing for the rest of their lives, and for others they turn in another direction and create something else.
Great, thank you. So let's just shift a little bit. If anything, this last year has provided a lot of opportunity for introspection, as we've kind of witnessed what everybody calls these dual pandemics, right? We've got COVID and we've got racial violence. So, and this expression of being an anti-racist, which of course we're all familiar with and thinking about. So I want to ask both of you, and maybe Bob, I'll start with you if it's okay. And how has the conversation about anti-Semitism changed, about anti-racism, the way that you talk and you teach and you think about anti-Semitism? And how do we think about anti-Semitism as this contemporary issue, while also taking in the pressing needs of racial justice?
Sure, this is such a good question. It's such an important question. First of all, I think when we talk about anti-Semitism in this environment, we need to be sensitive and we need to be honest. And anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism are not the same, although I believe that they are definitely related. And we have a long history of anti-Semitism, and we still face hatred. In fact, the American Jewish Committee put out a survey just a few months ago, and it showed that 37% of American Jews in the last 5 years experienced some form of anti-Semitism, and 31% have avoided places or events because they are Jewish. But we also have to acknowledge that our experience in America is very different, as you've heard earlier, from that of Black people and African Americans in particular. And we have been largely welcomed and accepted, whereas clearly there is a continuation of systemic racism in our criminal justice system, in our electoral system. I mean, just think about the fact that there are, I believe, something like 250 measures, state measures in 43 states that are attempting to suppress the vote of minorities, in particular of Black people. So on the other hand, when we think about white privilege, because this is something that comes up. Now, not every Jew is white. My wife is a woman of color. She's Persian descent. But many of us do not identify as white. That's not our core identity. And let's remember that while we have a degree of white privilege, there's no question about that. There are things that can happen to a Black person that will not happen to us because of the color of our skin. However, white privilege does not protect us from being victims of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic hate incidents. In fact, Bret Stephens in a column just, I believe last week, Bret Stephens is a writer for the New York Times. He talked about this issue, and he said that whiteness for Jews erases our past and racializes our present. I thought that was very poignant. And lastly, I want to say that there is this relationship. Judy, you alluded to it when you were talking about Eric Ward's skin in the game. First of all, white nationalists hate, that we the Jews may be the main target, but we know that what begins with us doesn't end with us. Of course, white nationalists hate people of color, they hate people who are from the LGBTQ community and so on. But there is this anti-Semitic trope that Jews are, it's that old trope that Jews control the government, they control the media, they control the banks and so on. And there's this trope that Jews are working behind the scenes to undermine the maintenance of this ideal of a white ethno-American. And we saw that with the civil rights movement, where it was questioned by how could white nationalists explain that an inferior, so-called inferior race was victorious in the civil rights movement? It's because, of course, the Jews were the ones that were orchestrating it. The mass migration of, so-called mass migration of people of color from our southern border flooding into our country, again, Jews are blamed for that, and that's exactly why the murderer of those that were slaughtered at the Tree of Life synagogue. Why did he pick that synagogue? It's because the Jews were working with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, bringing refugees into this country. So there is this relationship that's unfortunate, but to me, it just says that's just a more compelling reason why we need to partner with other minority communities in order to combat hate.
Thank you. Ellen, how's your teaching changed? Or
Teaching change, or our conversations in, you're saying, in the wake of the anti-racist campaign? Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what Bob said. I think the anti-racist conversation obviously has the potential to and should encompass a conversation about anti-Semitism. But the particular anti-racist conversation during the last couple of years, and particularly since the murder of George Floyd these last several months, has been so urgently around Black Lives Matter, both locally and nationally, and about Native lives here in Oregon. I've been involved in a lot of discussions on my campus and beyond about the pioneer and the meaning of the pioneer in our society. And now, of course, especially since Tuesday, but all year long, really, about Asian American lives, that, to be honest, very few of the conversations billed as anti-racist conversations that I've been involved in, whether in my community or at my university, including those within the Jewish community, like at my synagogue, few of those have really centered on or even had a lot to say about anti-Semitism specifically. And I agree with Bob. It's really striking because anti-Semitism is on the rise. There's no question about that. It has been the last several years. You think about Charlottesville, or you think about the Tree of Life massacre, or January 6th, right? And we see the unleashing of what is clearly the most extreme variant of anti-Semitism that I've seen in my lifetime, without question. And we saw them moving from the extreme to the mainstream during the Trump administration. But even in the face of all of that, I think there's clearly more urgency in the broader anti-racist discussion around the threat faced by people of color, exactly as Bob was saying, which most Jews are not people of color. And so I think that the impact of the focus on anti-racism has been much more to prompt a lot of conversation within the Jewish community about white privilege, because those of us who identify as white or are seen as white as we walk around in our communities, we don't generally fear the police, right? We don't generally feel threatened in our own neighborhoods in the way that people of color do. And many of us are, whether we like it or not, we are direct beneficiaries of racial structures that enabled our parents as white people to buy houses in the suburbs and send us to well-funded public schools at a time when people of color didn't have access to those schools in those neighborhoods and those privileges. So I think that that the impact of the whole anti-racist discussion on my conversations about anti-Semitism has been in some ways not a conversation as much about anti-Semitism as it would have normally been, but to look inward. And just one other thing, I think I said something like those of us who identify or are seen as white. One change that is really palpable within the Jewish community as a direct result of this focus on anti-racism is the really dramatic increase in the recognition of racial diversity within the Jewish community. I think just a couple of years ago, we would routinely refer to the Jewish community as white or think of it as largely in Ashkenazic terms. And now there is much more recognition of the growing internal diversity of the community. And so in these conversations, I've noticed people are much more aware and careful when we're reckoning with issues of white privilege, particularly, to be aware of that intersectionality and to recognize that there are many Jews who are both Jewish and African-American or Jewish and Asian American, right? And so I think that's been a real change and quite a rapid change in the way that we have these conversations in the last couple of years.
Yeah. Bob, were you going to say something? Or... Okay. Let's just stick with, there's a question in the chat, and I think now's a good time just to pose it, because the question is simply, how can Portland, so anybody who was fortunate to hear Walida Imarisha talk about Black Oregonians got a really good history in Oregon's exclusion laws, and she very adeptly explained why there have been so few Black people in Oregon since the 1840s, and how that changed after during the Second World War with the influx of African Americans who worked in the shipyards, but what happened to them afterwards. So there are historic reasons why the numbers of Black people in Oregon are small. The question is, how do we become more welcoming to Jews of color? And I really like this question. We deal with it at the museum. We have security guards in uniform. They have the potential to create an environment of fear for a person of color, where for someone else, they might just enter a synagogue, enter the museum, feel protected because they see that person in a uniform. So do either of you have any thoughts about how we become more welcoming?
Well, I would just say, I think we have to recognize what Ellen just said, that the Jewish community is becoming more and more diversified. And look, that we're talking about Portland here. Okay, in other communities, there are a lot more Jews of color. If you go to Israel, half the population are Jews of color. And I think that we do have to make a special effort to be welcoming. I've heard horror stories in our own community about Jews who are Black, who felt that they were not welcomed into our synagogues. And that's just unacceptable. We have to recognize that Jews come in all stripes. That's why I know there was a question about whether anti-Semitism is racism, and it's not. In my mind, it's not, because Jews come in all races and ethnicities. We are a very diverse people. And so we have to recognize that that is the case. And we shouldn't be suspicious just because a Black person happens to show up the front door of our synagogue. And also, we have to also recognize that their experience, because they have a part of their identity that is not shared by the majority of Jews. And that, of course, is skin color. They have different experiences, and we should recognize and be sensitive to it.
Anything to add, Ellen? Or
I agree. We definitely have to come back to that racism, but not right now. But I agree. I think that while we're talking about examining our white privilege, we also need to do it internally. There is a term, Ashkenormativity, this assumption of Ashkenazi-ness, right, within the Jewish community. And so one sees an Asian Jew, for example, and it's people. They report, as Bob is saying, African-American Jews, Asian-American Jews, and so on, report that they walk into a synagogue and people are asking them, like, what are you doing here? There's an assumption that they don't belong. And that has to be something that I think, communities talk about and raise awareness of, because obviously that's an incredibly alienating and unwelcoming experience.
Well, let's just go to the question that Bob alluded to that both of you know I wanted to hear your thoughts on. And Ellen, I'll stay with you. Do you think anti-Semitism is a form of racism?
Yeah, actually, I do. I disagree with Bob there. I mean, I think some would argue that it's the original form of racism, in that the scaffolding of kind of modern racism in the late 19th century, the so-called scientific racism that emerged in the mid to late 19th century in Europe, was built around anti-Semitism. And those articulations of anti-Semitism kind of undergirded the fullest expression that we see in the US, the Henry Ford era, and the protocols and all of that. And it still circulates as anti-Semitic tropes. And even though, this is always a challenge, you on the one hand say race is a social construction, so it's not real in a genetic sense, right? But it's a reality in people's lives. And among anti-Semites, they don't see Jews as some kind of social gathering or as a religious gathering, because it doesn't matter if you're religious or not, right? They see it as a racial group bent on world control, right? Through capitalism or communism or the media or banking or liberal thinking or whatever it is. But these are racialized ideas, and they're racial because the people who believe them see them as inherent genetic traits, which isn't to say that I believe Jews are a race. I do not. But to say that anti-Semitism is a form of racism, and that is still at the core of these anti-Semitic tropes. So that Soros is controlling the world, or Jews are spreading and then benefiting from COVID, right? These kinds of tropes play on, somewhat older anti-Semitic tropes, but the underlying kind of unity that comes out of the late 19th century is this idea that they are that it's a racial plot. Right?
Bob, do you want to?
No, I understand. Ellen makes a good case. Certainly the Nazis considered us an inferior race, quote unquote. I just feel that when we get labeled as such, it really overlooks the fact that we are such a diverse people with I mean, if you just look at the state of Israel, people have come from over 100 different countries, 100 different ethnicities and cultures, and certainly different skin colors. So I struggle with the idea that anti-Semitism is racism. But look, and the bottom line is that this hatred all comes from the same place.
Right. Good. So Bob, why you want to tell us a little bit about this upsurge we've seen in white nationalism and anti-Semitism, and to
Sure.
what do we attribute it?
Well, that's a complex question for sure. And I want to give a shout out to Randy Blazak, who's the chair of the Coalition Against Hate Crimes. And he will be with us at the May 26th summit, talking about the growing threat of what.
Did he?
Obvious thing is the internet. The internet, with its hate platforms and websites, has made recruiting by white nationalist groups much easier, especially among young people. And it's much easier for someone to become radicalized in the privacy of their own living room. But I think we have to go deeper than that. We have to think about what's happening in society. I want to refer to a book that I just finished, which if you haven't read, I'm sure many of you have, and that's Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, The Origins of Our Discontent. And there you go. I think it should be required reading for every high school history class. And the way, and I'll sort of get to this in a roundabout way, she describes systemic racism in America as a caste system, as in what you would find in India. And she talks about the dominant caste, which is the white majority. And then there is the subordinate caste, which are people of color. And then the lower rung of that are African Americans, which is a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. And within the white majority, of course, there is the sort of the lower rung, which are working class, non-college educated whites, and that is probably where that subgroup is where you're going to find the majority of white nationalists. And the way that she describes this is that their main interest is maintaining this caste system and their place in the dominant caste. And when they see upward mobilization by those in the lower caste, African Americans, it foments resentment and outrage and deeper hate. And so, and by the way, and who's orchestrating, who's supporting that effort? It's the Jews that are supporting that effort. So when we have in America in 2008, the election to the highest office of an African American, which, by the way, the overwhelming majority of Jews voted for Barack Obama, it's no surprise that we see an uptick in white nationalist activity. And then now you fast forward to 2016, and I'm going to try not to get political here. I understand, look, you may agree or disagree with Trump's policies. That's not, but it would be hard to ignore the fact that here was a presidential candidate who was not only feeding off of their grievances and their resentment, but he was fueling it as well. And then once in the White House, by virtue of his divisive rhetoric and his spreading of conspiracy theories and his support for QAnon, that it's no wonder that white nationalist groups not only grew in size, but they were emboldened. They came out of the shadows of society. I mean, think about, I think Ellen, I think you mentioned Charlottesville, where neo-Nazis marched and chanted, "Jew shall not replace us." And we know how Trump described them as very few people, or describing the insurgents at our, that broke into the United States Capitol by calling them good Americans, patriots. So what you're seeing is a mainstreaming effect. And think about this. In 2018, in the elections, there were over 350 white nationalists that ran for local, state, or national office. And in fact, two of them were the Republican nominees for congressional districts in Illinois and California. Between the two of them, they received almost 100,000 votes. Yet they were self-proclaimed neo-Nazis and Holocaust deniers. Now, to be fair, the Republican Party disavowed them, but the fact that they got that many votes is alarming. Now, we also know the ADL just came out with a report that in 2020, there was almost a doubling of the distribution of white nationalist propaganda. Here in Portland, a couple of years ago, we saw some of this. We saw posters that were offensive, anti-Semitic posters with these horrible caricatures of Orthodox Jews that were posted on utility poles near some of our synagogues and other Jewish institutions. And then lastly, I do want to also point out what we found out today. A national intelligence report came out today talking about the growing threat of anti-Semitic white nationalism. Domestic terrorism is how they call it. And they connect it directly to the big lie, to the conspiracy theory that somehow the election was stolen or rigged against Donald Trump. So those are some things to think about.
Yeah, thank you. Ellen, I want to talk to you about your current scholarship, and I will just say how grateful everyone who's listening in should be for you and your scholarship. Ellen served on our board for many years, which was wonderful for us. And every time she writes anything, we just take it in. And you've really been a mentor for us at the museum and helping us to shape our own understanding of Oregon Jewish history. And I think what is so, what we're all re-envisioning, right? We're all having to rethink things since really since George Floyd's death. And perhaps we can, Bob, you mentioned the going back to 2016 and the presidential campaign in our last 4 years without getting too political. But as a scholar of Jewish history, how have you reconsider Jewish stories of persecution within the American narrative of race, which I know you're doing, and you're really working on some really exciting stuff. So say a little bit about your current work.
Yeah, I would say it's been a dramatic change in a lot of ways for me over the last year or two. When I talk about Oregon or Western Jewish history and the relative absence of anti-Semitism, as I did at the start of our session today, right? I've long tried to make the point that one of the factors that enabled that broad acceptance was that the tent of whiteness, so to speak, was really large in Oregon and in the West. And that was because of the perception of racial others who were more different, perceived as more threatening, right? So initially indigenous peoples whom the settlers were displacing, often violently, but whom the settlers viewed as a threat to their project, right? And both African Americans and Asian immigrants whom the settlers pioneers endeavored to exclude. And so because the focus was on that kind of exclusion, Jews and Italians or Irish, other people who might have been more marginally white in the East, entered into the big tent of whiteness more so in the West. But I had always framed that story more in relationship to Jewish history, both in terms of 19th century Europe, where these immigrants came from, where anti-Semitism was rife, and also elsewhere in America, back east, where the level of acceptance was not nearly as high. And so the headline for my research on Oregon was really kind of, wow, look how much more included Jews were in Oregon. Isn't that amazing? And over the last several years, as I've become more engaged in conversations about anti-racism in Oregon, and I've been particularly involved on my campus in discussions about Native history and the figure of the pioneer, I've really reframed this. So it's no longer, wow, look how much more included Jews were in Oregon, but it's, oh my goodness, Jews were pioneers. Like, what does that mean vis-a-vis Native history in Oregon, or African-American history, or Asian American history, right? And so how do we acknowledge both this remarkable acceptance of Jews in white society as kind of an amazing opening of opportunity for Jews, but at the same time really reckon with the implications? What does it mean to be full participants in the actions of that society, which included genocide of Native peoples, right? And I'm not saying that Jews were uniquely responsible for this or anything, but they were part of this larger society, and full inclusion was linked to those activities. And Jews were Indian fighters, and they were settlers on Native lands, and in their role as merchants even, and traders and suppliers, they enabled settlement on those lands, and those activities contributed to their acceptance in white society and to the theft of Native lands. And so I think we need to wrestle with this. I'm wrestling with it as a historian. We need to wrestle with it in the Jewish community, just as the larger white community does. And I think that challenge is one that's increasingly threading through our current discussions about race and anti-racism. So over the last number of decades, we've often celebrated the Jewish role in supporting civil rights movement. We see that as a product of our historic and recent experiences with anti-Semitism, and that's all genuine. But we have to do more to fully engage the degree to which we, or at least those of us who are white or are read as white as we move through society, how we both benefit from those privileges that come with that and participate in the activities that kind of support the scaffolding of those structures.
Yeah, no, very exciting. So I mentioned the tentative title of this book that you're editing, of which you have this very important chapter. Do you know when the book will be out?
We are hoping for 2022, spring of 2022. So
I think it's really going to contribute to scholarship for Jewish history. So I thank you for that. Well, we have so many questions in the chat. I feel like I should ask some of these questions. So someone does ask, just looking at arrivals, I guess, in the 19th, early 20th century, and someone asks, I guess, Ellen, I'll start with you, and then Bob, please do chime in. But So the Jews who arrived, particularly the Central European Jews, they had arrived, and it was, as you say, more of a level playing field, at least with the other white people. They gained acceptance. So was that descriptive for other minorities? I know the answer to this, but we could. So someone is just wondering, was it the same for other minorities? So let's think about Japanese arrivals, Chinese arrivals, and the black, the few black people who made it into the state. Very
Yeah,
different.
it's typical for other European origin peoples. So in general, in the West, the Irish, the Italians, other groups like Jews who, came largely from Europe, but who were, we often say, not quite white, right? Who were legally white, which means that they were able to naturalize and become American citizens, right? But they were not fully accepted back east. They were more included here. The exact opposite was true for immigrants from Asia and also for African Americans. African Americans, of course, there were moves from the territorial period and then renewed at the time of statehood to completely ban African Americans from the state, to not allow slavery, but also not allow free blacks to settle. And so that was a completely different climate for them. And likewise for Asian immigrants, against whom there was tremendous hostility and all sorts of efforts to restrict them. It was largely from the Western states that the Chinese Exclusion Act originated, that efforts to eliminate Japanese exclusion. It was a very different experience for Europeans versus non-Europeans.
Right. Bob, I didn't know, do you want to add anything or?
No, I'm going to defer to the historian
And,
among us.
and Ellen, I'll stay with you for a minute, and then Bob, plenty of questions for you. But someone is asking, and I actually thought of it when you were talking, how did those German Jews treat the arrival of the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic Jews when they came? I mean, the Central Europe, but Eastern European and Russian Jews, when they arrived, they were all Ashkenazi, but came from different parts of the world. So there was also, you tell us about this, what happened when they came.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were most definitely tensions, and in general, the German Jews in America in general, and in Germany for that matter, tended to look upon their East European brethren as kind of too religious, too, not as kind of civilized and advanced and acculturated and so on and so forth. I mean, they even, they referred to Yiddish. It was considered a kind of a lower language than German. But I would say that those tensions, although I know a lot of people in the Portland oral histories emphasize the differences between the communities, I think the tensions were actually a little bit less here. And the reason for that is because, first of all, there was a middle group that came in the 60s and 70s, 1860s and 70s, who were from Posen, which is kind of in between. It was in Eastern Prussia, and it was kind of an in-between zone. So somewhat more culturally Eastern European, but at the same time German. And that kind of eased the transition. And also when the Eastern Europeans started to arrive here, they were not fresh off the boat. So the first Eastern Europeans who arrived here, many of them, like the German predecessors, had lived in a series of places across the United States, often very rural, not Jewish places. And so by the time they got here, they spoke English, a lot of them. It was actually the people who came later into the 20th century who might come more directly because they had relatives here already. So those tensions, while much talked about in community histories, were actually a little milder, I think, in Oregon than in other parts of the country.
Bob, a question for you. Can you talk a little bit about the connection between QAnon and anti-Semitism? And do you think that QAnon has infiltrated into Oregon? Do we have any reason to believe they're here?
Wow. Well, I will say, first of all, I'm not the expert on conspiracy theories, but we will have a session during the summit on which Western States Center will be presenting. Look, from what I understand of what QAnon is, that it's this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory where it's absolutely crazy is what it is. That that there is an elite group of Democrats and Jews that are running this child sex trafficking ring. And um, I really, that's what I know about it. But I think what's scary about it is the fact that the people who are attracted to this conspiracy theory are the ones that we're most worried about. They're the ones who are more prone to violence. And we saw that on January 6th. So I'm really not, I wish I could tell you more about it than I only know what I've read and heard from, different media reports about it. But a lot of these conspiracy theories have the same sort of tropes, that it is the Jews, and these are age old, that the Jews are the ones who are orchestrating things behind the scenes. They are, running the government. They are running our foreign policy. They are running our banks. They are running Hollywood. It's the same sort of thing over and over and over again. And it just doesn't seem to ever go away. And these are the same, by the way, these are the same tropes that you see on white nationalists or neo-Nazi sort of websites. So cyber hate is growing, and it's a concern, and we have to be able to monitor it very closely. Judy, there is another question, if you don't mind. I saw in the Q&A, someone was asking about, well, how, there are Jews who support BDS, so how can BDS be anti-Semitic?
Just going to ask.
Okay. And I get this question a lot. And again, I want to reiterate that I don't believe that everyone who is sympathetic to the BDS movement is an anti-Semite. I know people who I probably work with, pastors who I work with on other social justice issues, who might be sympathetic to the BDS movement because they believe, I believe incorrectly, they believe that it is simply a movement whose goal is to change Israeli policy rather than to eliminate Israel altogether. And I think it's important to understand that, look, anti-Semitism isn't based on the characteristics of the person who is an anti-Semite. Just as there are Black people who can be racist, there are Jews who can be racist or anti-Semitic. And one of the things that there's this debate going around, well, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? And the way that I approach that question is the fact that I, as a Jew, and I think many Jews, identify, see, I told you I don't identify as a white person. That's not, when I think about what my core identity is, I don't judge it by my skin color. What I think about as first of all, I'm Jewish and I am a Zionist, which means that I believe in the right of the Jewish people to national self-determination in their ancient homeland. And that is part of my core Jewish identity. I think I speak for a lot of Jews in the United States, not everyone. And so when Jews are being excluded by BDS activists, supporters, say being excluded from other social justice movements. For example, going back, I know we're getting a little bit off track here in terms of Oregon, but Chicago, there was a Dyke March in support of LGBTQ rights. There were 3 Jewish women who were carrying a rainbow flag with a Star of David in the middle, and they were expelled from the march. Why? What was their crime? They refused to disavow Israel and disavow their Zionist identity. So when you attack Zionism, you are attacking my personal identity. And that I regard as anti-Semitism. I also believe that there are Jewish anti-Zionist groups that are actually shielding the BDS movement from charges of anti-Semitism. And whether you can say the BDS movement is inherently anti-Semitic, or whether you can say much of what they do in effect, if not intent, is anti-Semitic. Most of those charges are coming from outside the Jewish community. I showed you 2 examples in my earlier presentation, like the German parliament. So it's an ongoing debate, and it's not one we're going to settle tonight, but this is my perspective on it.
And what about the question? It's a question in the chat. I actually have my own answer to it, but I'd be more interested in yours. And I have people called me up and said, but when the Black Lives Movement was anti-Semitic. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's a misconception. Um, so what they're referring to, I'm assuming, about 5 years ago, the movement for Black Lives, which was the umbrella movement under which you find Black Lives Matter, which, by the way, is not monolithic. So that movement issued a platform. And there was one plank, one paragraph that was written that I believe claimed that Israel was an apartheid state and was committing genocide. These are false claims, of course. By the way, that plank was written by a Jew. Um, but in any case, I don't even know that you can find that platform anymore. Um, the Black Lives Matter movement, as I said, is not monolithic. They're made up of local groups all over the country. And yes, there are maybe a handful of them that take an approach that you would consider to be perhaps anti-Semitic or pro-BDS. But by and large, they're really not concerned with the Jewish community. And they also, at least I know locally, many of our Black partners, our partners in the African American community, understand full well that while we too are suffering from rising anti-Semitism, we realize that right now the most immediate problem is racial injustice and systemic racism, and that they can find in us a strong partner to collaborate with, because we understand persecution, we understand oppression, just as we were at the forefront of the civil rights movement. We need to be upfront now, in whether it's the Black community, the Asian community, or the LGBTQ community.
Great, thank you. Ellen, anything you want to add there, or?
No, I would agree with what Bob said.
Ellen, there was a question I think you can clear it up pretty quickly. I think someone just wants to know about the urban renewal project in South Portland. You know, it was a project. Was there any anti-Semitic overtones with Jews being displaced from South Portland in your mind?
No, and I don't think so. Although there was, you'll have to remind me which synagogue it was that had just moved and rededicated, and then it got hit by the highway project, so it had to move twice. And the quip from the rabbi was, that it was an anti-Semitic highway. But I mean, I think the neighborhood in South Portland, from which most of the Jewish community had already moved, was widely considered, including by many who lived there, as being a neighborhood that was, that had seen better days. Now, in terms of the particular plan and what it was replaced with and all of that a lot of it was paved over, that's another question. I think those are questions with a lot of the urban renewal projects from that era. But in my reading of the oral histories from that time, I mean, I can't really think, I can think of a few people like Essie Reinhardt who stood against urban renewal, but I can't think of any people who felt that it was particularly targeting Jews or that it was anti-Semitic.
I would agree. There's actually a marvelous question that I'm going to try and encapsulate here, and it's really about celebrating differences, or diversity and equality. So the question is, shouldn't we, if I understand the question, isn't it better if we all look at ourselves as American, and then our preferences, if we're Jewish, if we ascribe to Judaism, if we ascribe to Protestantism, that also defines who we are. But if we start with the central premise where we all are one thing, and would that help us to not deny, for others not to deny what we also hold to be true with ourselves? Am I being clear with this question? It's in the chat, 816. But it's a great question, but I'm not. Yeah, tell me.
Well, I think we should be proud of our identities, however we just identify ourselves. I'm a proud Jew. I'm a proud Zionist. But I think, I don't know if this is what the person is asking about, but I said it in the beginning when I was talking about the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. To me, an attack on anyone because of race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, ethnicity, whatever it may be, is really an attack against all of us. And I mean that sincerely. So it hurts me to hear about these attacks on our Asian brothers and sisters, or attacks on anyone for that matter. I mean, when I watch these videos of these elderly Asian Americans being assaulted, just brutally assaulted for just walking down the street, it pains me. It pains me as an American. And so I think it is important for us to recognize that we're all, we should all be in this together. And that's why it's so important for us, especially our minority community partners, that we come together and figure out how we can stand in solidarity to make sure that hate is not welcome in our community, in our backyard. And we have to learn what are those strategies, resources, organizations that can help us collectively combat hate. So I think it's an important concept, but I do still believe that it's important for us to be proud about however it is we identify ourselves, whether we're indigenous or whatever we are. So I don't want to lose sight of that.
Good. Yeah. Ellen, anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would agree absolutely with what Bob said, and I think in response to the question, I think that part of the problem that we're responding to, whether we're talking about anti-Semitism or anti-Black racism, or anti-Asian sentiment, is that there are Americans who don't have an inclusive vision, right? Who believe that true Americans are of one particular stripe. And that it goes to sort of the core of the problem, I think.
I recognize I didn't want to correct myself because, of course, I didn't know how to pronounce QAnon because I've never actually said it out loud. I realized a word I've been avoiding. So thank you for correcting me.
Judy, there's a question I think for you in the Q&A. I'd be curious to hear your take on it, which is about reference to Japanese internment camps as concentration camps. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I was going to ask the two of you. So the Japanese American National Museum in California started using the word concentration camp. They replaced the word internment camp for concentration camp decades ago already. They have been since I think the late 1990s. And when they sent an exhibit, the first time a traveling exhibit with the word concentration camp went to Ellis Island, to the Ellis Island Museum, the New Yorkers just, it was more than they could handle. And it was so new. I think, if I understand correctly, I think they did put the word back for that exhibit to internment camp. So it's been a gradual shift, but of course, and Ellen, you can chime in here, but the word concentration camp predates the Nazis. It is exactly what it means, a concentration of people. It precisely describes what happens to the Japanese American, Japanese Oregonians, Japanese Americans who were interned or concentrated into a place where they needed to be restricted from movement. So I actually support the word. We use Japanese concentration camps at the museum. So Ellen, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, I've written about the Japanese, what I call, and what many historians of this experience call the Japanese removal, the forced removal from the West Coast, and incarceration, which is a much more accurate description than calling it internment. Internment is a legal process in which people have the opportunity to defend themselves, and it's selective. So there were people interned during World War II. They were people who, edited pro-fascist newspapers and whatnot, or for whatever reason were individually suspect, and they were rounded up by the FBI right after Pearl Harbor. And so internment is a misnomer for what happened to Japanese Americans who had no opportunity to defend themselves and were sent away on the basis of their ancestry. And they were sent to concentration camps, which is what they were called at the time. And what happened is that we've adopted a euphemism for the Nazi death camps, which should be called death camps. Well, they were not concentration camps. Their purpose was not to concentrate the population. It was to kill people. And so, there's kind of a cascade of poorly named, events that coincide and that generate a lot of anger about that nomenclature. But I think that there are, they're problematic on multiple fronts. Concentration camp is an accurate description for the places where the Japanese Americans were imprisoned during World War II.
Yeah, and I would just add, and I agree with Ellen completely. Right, we should refer to the Nazi camps as death camps.
And we do.
And this term, the concentration camp term, has been used in other contexts. At the southern border of the United States, where migrants were being concentrated into these facilities that were really inhumane. The Uyghur community in China, that are now being interned they are in concentration camps. So I think it's an appropriate use of that name. And I think we get stuck on it because we think about it should be unique to the Holocaust. What was unique to the Holocaust, of course, was the level of genocide and the fact that these were indeed death camps. If they were being concentrated, they were being concentrated to be deported to the death camps.
Great, thank you. I think we're coming to the end of our time, and I just want to thank you both. And Ellen, if you don't mind, I'm actually going to give the last question to Bob. Gives him a chance to mention the summit once again, the date of the summit, but also Bob, and Ellen, thank you so much. And but Bob, what are your hopes and dreams for this summit, post-summit? What do you envision? You Federation, this wonderful committee you've put together, have done some really constructive work getting these conversations started. So what comes next for you?
Oh, thank you for that. This was just an idea that a few of us had back over the summer, and we started reaching out. Now we, as the Jewish Federation, we had relationships with certain communities. Certainly, we had a really good relationship with the Latino community through the Latino Network. We've had relationships with the NAACP and other groups. There were some other communities that we had absolutely no relationship with. The Asian community was one of those. The indigenous community was another. And so we started reaching out to these different communities, the different organizations, and we've brought everybody together, very much focused on this mission of putting these programs together to educate about this, what we've called the hidden history, because it has been so ignored or whitewashed or distorted. And it's so important, especially for our students, to learn about this history. And now moving forward, it felt like we needed to take a step back in order to move forward to effectively address and have conversations around those issues of systemic racism and so on. Now, what happens next? Well, that is going to be a conversation that we have with our partners going forward. But I want to really stress that the summit is not a one-off. We don't see it that way. This is all about building and strengthening our relationships with each other. And you never know what sort of benefits you will gain by having these sort of relationships. And I can think of so many different examples. I remember, I'll just give you one example of the way that building these bridges bears fruit down the road. This was about 6 years ago. I noticed that there was a bill introduced to the state legislature that was Islamophobic. It was something about preventing Sharia law from being used in our state courts, as if that could ever be the case. It was an affront to the Muslim community. I immediately reached out to the president of one of our local mosques. I asked him if he knew about it. He didn't know about it, but he suggested that we together write a joint letter to every senator opposing this bill and pointing out how offensive it was. And we did that together. Well, a couple of years later, when we were having some problems with anti-Semitism on the PSU campus, and we felt that at the time the administration was not acting effectively or forcefully, we weren't getting a response. I reached back out to my friend, the president of the mosque, and he, together, and also with the director of Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, together we wrote a letter saying that this has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed appropriately and immediately. And sure enough, we started to see changes. That's the sort of relationship that we're hoping to build down the road. So how that's going to translate into specific programs or activities, that stay tuned, because we have, in fact, our next meeting with our partners will be discussing exactly this. But I really want to stress, this is really as much about, it's obviously about education. It's also about bridge building.
Thank you. The summit, someone is just asking, we'll say it again. Summit is
The summit is May 26th. It's a Wednesday, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. If you can't join us for all 4 hours, then please try and join us for, so it'll be the first hour will be a plenary session. We'll have an introduction to implicit bias. The next 2 hours will be, you'll have a choice of about 8 different breakout sessions in each 1 hour block. And then at the 12 noon hour, we will have Eric Ward. He will be speaking about, I'm sure, about the connection between anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism, but more importantly, he'll be talking about where do we go from here as a community? What are the strategies and resources that we can avail ourselves of in order to effectively combat hate? So I really hope you'll sign up. The link to register is in the chat, or in the queue. Yeah, it's in the chat. So please do so. You'll see more and more publicity coming out by the end of the month. And by the way, I do also want to thank Rachel Nelson, who runs the high tech for all of these programs. And she does it because none of us can do it. And she does it well.
goodness. I really want to thank you both. Our brilliant education director always says that she feels a program is successful if people leave with more questions than answers. And
There you go.
I think that we've raised a lot of really good questions. You've actually offered a lot of answers, but I'm sure everybody is leaving this program, still with questions. I'll just urge you to do a couple of things. One, read Ellen's books. Read both of Ellen's books about Oregon Jewish history, because they are concise and wonderful. And also, you might take a look at the websites of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Yad Vashem, because those are 3 websites that have very, very good information about anti-Semitism, both the history and the definition and where it's going today. So I'll throw those out there.
And get this book and read it, because she compares the caste system in America to India and also to Nazi Germany. And it is brilliantly written. It's a lot of storytelling, and it is very, very powerful.
Apologies that I didn't answer. We didn't get to everyone's question. We'll do it again, right? But thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Bob and Ellen, thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you very much.
Rachel, thank you too.
Good
Good night,
night.
everyone. See you.